The official history tells us that port cities grow organically. First comes trade, then infrastructure expands to meet demand. Boston, Liverpool, Baltimore, they all follow this pattern. Small docks appear, commerce increases, and over decades the infrastructure catches up. But when you examine the foundations beneath these cities, something doesn't align. In 1820, Baltimore's harbor facilities could accommodate vessel traffic that wouldn't materialize for another 30 years. Liverpool's dock systems in 1815 had capacity ratings that exceeded the city's entire recorded merchant fleet by a factor of 3. Charleston's waterfront infrastructure, catalogued in 1825, was designed to handle cargo volumes the city wouldn't process until after the Civil War. The pattern repeats across both sides of the Atlantic. Infrastructure built massively, records showing modest use, decades of apparent underutilization. And then suddenly the ships arrived. Before we go further, this is not a conspiracy investigation. This is a documentary examination of historical records, architectural surveys, and census data that exist in public archives. The observations we're exploring have appeared in academic journals, urban history studies, and infrastructure analyses for decades. What we're doing here is compiling them into a single narrative and asking whether the pattern means something. The accepted explanation is straightforward. City planners were ambitious. They overbuilt. They anticipated growth that took longer to materialize than expected. Victorian engineers were optimistic about expansion. That explanation works in isolation. But the scale starts to complicate it. In 1816, New York's waterfront underwent a transformation that puzzles historians who study trade records from that period. The South Street Seaport Complex, along with adjacent pier systems, suddenly featured stone foundations capable of supporting warehouses 3 stories tall, warehouses that wouldn't be built for another 15 years. The foundations were already there. The Port Authority records from 1818 show something unusual: maintenance budgets for pier systems that hadn't yet been officially constructed. There are line items for stone reinforcement and subsurface grading on docks that appear in city maps as empty waterfront. You can see this in the archival maps held at the New York Public Library. Foundations drawn in detail. Superstructures absent. The explanation given at the time was preparedness. The city was planning ahead. But here's where it gets specific. Those 1816 foundations weren't generic. They were designed with weight distribution for specific types of cargo: heavy goods, bulk storage, high turnover loading. The engineering specifications exist in the municipal records. They describe systems built for trade patterns that New York wouldn't experience until the 1830s, after the Erie Canal fully opened and Great Lakes commerce flooded the port. The foundations knew what was coming. Or they were built by people who did. Liverpool shows the same sequence. In 1815, the Albert Dock system had foundational infrastructure rated for steamer traffic. Steamships were experimental in 1815. They weren't common cargo vessels. The Atlantic wasn't being crossed by steam-powered ships in regular commercial service. But the dock foundations, the submerged pilings, the reinforced stone moorings, they were already engineered for the stress loads that steamships would create. When the SS Great Western began regular transatlantic service in 1838, Liverpool's docks didn't need retrofitting. They were ready. Not adapted. Ready. The city's own engineering surveys from the 1840s note this. There's a report filed by the Mersey Docks and Harbor Board in 1843 describing foundational systems of uncertain origin, predating current operational demands. The report doesn't speculate. It just observes. Foundations older than the need. Systems in place before the technology arrived. Boston's situation is similar but stranger. The Long Wharf, constructed in phases between 1710 and 1760, was rebuilt in 1805 with foundations that dramatically exceeded anything the city's trade volume required. Granite pilings sunk to depths that wouldn't be standard practice until the 1850s. Load-bearing calculations optimized for iron-hulled vessels. Iron hulls weren't in use yet. The Massachusetts Historical Society holds the construction records. The specifications describe future-facing maritime infrastructure. That's the actual phrasing. Future-facing. For a port city in 1805, handling mostly wooden merchant sloops and coastal trading ships, the engineering was excessive. But by 1840, when iron-hulled clipper ships began dominating Atlantic trade, Boston didn't need to expand its docks. The infrastructure was already sufficient. The foundations had been waiting. Here's where the cross-regional consistency becomes hard to ignore. Charleston, Savannah, Philadelphia, Norfolk, all show the same pattern in the same 15-year window, roughly 1810 to 1825. During this period, port infrastructure in these cities expands or gets rebuilt with foundations that exceed documented need by decades. And it's not just capacity, it's specificity. The warehouse districts built during this period in these cities share architectural features that wouldn't become standard until mid-century. Reinforced flooring for heavy machinery, ventilation systems for bulk grain storage, ceiling heights designed for mechanical cranes. These features appear in buildings constructed before the machinery existed, before the grain trade justified them, before the cranes were invented. The buildings were ready for systems that hadn't arrived yet. And when those systems did arrive, when steam cranes, bulk grain shipping, and mechanized port operations became standard in the 1850s, the infrastructure didn't need modification. Fit perfectly. The timing raises questions that urban historians have noted but rarely compile into a single observation. If these port cities were simply overbuilding out of optimism, why did they all overbuild in the same way during the same narrow time period for the same future conditions? Why does the infrastructure align so precisely with needs that wouldn't exist for 30 years? And why does it feel less like preparation and more like continuation? The pattern isn't limited to coastal cities. When you move inland, the same architectural anticipation appears in places that had no immediate justification for it. In 1817, construction began on the Erie Canal, a project that would connect the Great Lakes to the Atlantic through New York State. The canal itself is well documented. What's less discussed is the infrastructure that appeared along its route before the canal was finished. Warehouse complexes in Buffalo, storage facilities in Rochester, grain elevators in Syracuse. Built between 1819 and 1823. The canal didn't open until 1825. These weren't small buildings. The Buffalo warehouses, cataloged in an 1821 survey, had foundations designed for multi-story stone construction and cargo volumes that wouldn't flow through the city for another decade. The survey describes commercial infrastructure in advance of operational demand. The language is careful, but the observation is clear. The buildings were waiting for the cargo. Britain shows the same sequence but earlier. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway, opened in 1830, is considered the world's first intercity passenger railway. But when you examine the infrastructure that existed along the route in 1825, before construction officially began, something unusual appears. Freight depots. Not passenger stations. Freight depots. The Manchester Warehousing Company records from 1826 describe the acquisition of land for rail-based cargo transfer. The company built loading platforms designed for rolling stock, wheeled cargo cars, 2 years before the railway opened, 4 years before freight service began. The platforms were built to specifications that matched the rail gauge exactly. Standard gauge, 4 feet, 8.5 inches. In 1826, standard gauge wasn't standard yet. It wouldn't become the dominant track width in Britain until the 1840s. But the Manchester platforms were already built to that measurement. They knew. Or the platforms were older than the railway. The administrative systems show the same timing issue. In 1811, Britain established the Board of Trade, a governmental body responsible for overseeing commerce, industry, and infrastructure development. The board's early records held at the National Archives in Kew contain something unexpected. Regulatory frameworks for industries that didn't exist yet. There are protocols from 1813 for managing mechanized textile production at scale. Britain's textile industry was still primarily workshop-based in 1813. The factory system wouldn't dominate until the 1830s. There are shipping regulations from 1815 for steam-powered transoceanic vessels. As noted earlier, transatlantic steam service didn't begin until 1838. There are safety standards from 1817 for rail-based freight systems. The Stockton and Darlington Railway, generally considered the first public railway, didn't open until 1825. The Board of Trade was writing rules for systems that hadn't been built. Unless they had. The United States had a parallel structure. In 1816, the Second Bank of the United States was chartered. Its primary function was managing currency and financing infrastructure projects. What's unusual is the scope of its initial organizational framework. The bank's charter, written in 1816, included provisions for financing, canal systems spanning multiple states, interstate railway construction, telegraph communication networks. Canals were just beginning. The Erie Canal was the first major project, started in 1817. Railways didn't exist as commercial systems in the United States in 1816. The telegraph wouldn't be invented until 1837. But the bank's financial infrastructure was already designed to fund them. The paperwork was ready. The loan categories existed. The bureaucratic framework was in place before the technologies it was meant to finance. Then there's the physical infrastructure that seems engineered beyond its stated purpose. The London sewer system, designed by Joseph Bazalgette and constructed in the 1860s, is a marvel of Victorian engineering. But Bazalgette's designs weren't entirely original. His plans incorporated older tunnel networks beneath London, tunnels that predate his project by decades. Some of these tunnels appear in surveys from the 1820s, described as drainage systems of indeterminate origin. Bazalgette didn't build new tunnels everywhere. In many areas, he connected existing infrastructure. Infrastructure that was already sized for a city much larger than 1820s London. The tunnels were designed for population densities London wouldn't reach until the 1880s, 60 years early. By the time London's population exploded during the late Victorian period, the drainage capacity was already sufficient. The city fit into infrastructure that had been waiting. In the United States, the same over-engineering appears in municipal water systems. Philadelphia's Fairmount Water Works, constructed between 1812 and 1815, had a pumping capacity far beyond the city's needs. The system could supply water to a population of 200,000. Philadelphia's population in 1815 was approximately 112,000. The city wouldn't reach 200,000 until the 1850s. For nearly 40 years, the water system operated at partial capacity. The Philadelphia Water Department's records from 1820 describe the infrastructure as provision for future expansion. But the system wasn't designed to be expanded. It was built complete. The pipes were already in the ground. The reservoirs were already dug. The pumping stations were already operational. There was nothing to expand. The system was simply larger than necessary. Until it wasn't. Boston's subway system shows a related peculiarity. The Tremont Street subway, opened in 1897, is considered the first subway in the United States. But during its construction, workers encountered older tunnel sections, bricked passages that didn't match any known city infrastructure project. The tunnels were incorporated into the subway system. There are references to these passages in the Boston Transit Commission's 1895 survey. The report describes them as pre-existing subterranean transit channels, origin undocumented. The channels were already graded for rail installation. The width matched the subway's track gauge. The brick reinforcement was structurally sound enough to be left in place. No one knows when they were built, but by 1897 they were ready. The pattern extends to grain storage. In the 1840s, massive grain elevators began appearing in American port cities: Buffalo, Chicago, Duluth. These were revolutionary structures, using steam-powered conveyor systems to move grain vertically into silos. But the foundations for these elevators in many cases predate the technology. Buffalo's Darts elevator, built in 1843, was constructed on a foundation laid in 1825, 18 years earlier. The foundation was already sized for a multi-story structure with significant weight load. Chicago's first steam-powered grain elevator was built in 1848. But Cook County land records show warehouse foundations along the Chicago River dating to the 1830s, foundations engineered for vertical construction and mechanical systems. The foundations knew what was coming, or they were remnants of what had been. Whether this reflects inheritance or convergence, the scale of the pattern is difficult to dismiss. Across 2 continents, in multiple cities, over a narrow time window, infrastructure appeared that exceeded need, not by modest margins but by decades. And when the demand finally arrived, the infrastructure didn't require adaptation. It was already correct. The docks fit the ships. The tunnels fit the trains. The warehouses fit the cargo. The foundations fit the future. And no one wrote down why. The word Tartaria appears on European maps beginning in the 13th century. It was a geographical label, a vast, loosely defined region covering Central Asia and parts of Siberia. The term derives from Tatar, referring to Turkic and Mongol peoples who inhabited the area. By the 19th century, the term had faded from official use. Modern nation-states replaced vague territorial labels. Tartaria disappeared from maps, but it never disappeared from certain historical discussions. In recent years, the term has been reinterpreted, not as a place, but as a framework for understanding architectural and infrastructural patterns that seem disconnected from the official timeline. When people refer to Tartaria, in this context, they're not claiming a hidden empire. They're using the term as shorthand for a hypothesis, that the infrastructure we attribute to 19th century expansion may have older origins, that the foundations, the systems, the over-engineered ports and tunnels might be remnants of something that came before. Three interpretations exist. The first interpretation is conventional, ambitious overbuilding. Victorian engineers were optimistic. They planned for growth. They constructed infrastructure with future demand in mind, even if that meant decades of underutilization. This explanation accounts for individual cases. The Erie Canal, the Liverpool docks, Philadelphia's water system, all could be examples of forward-thinking civic planning. But it struggles with the simultaneity. Why did cities across two continents overbuild in the same way, during the same narrow period, with the same precise anticipation of future needs? Optimism doesn't usually coordinate across borders. The second interpretation is organizational, inherited systems. This view suggests that 19th century expansion wasn't building from scratch. It was rebuilding, reactivating, or adapting infrastructure that already existed in some form. The older tunnels beneath London, the pre-existing foundations in Buffalo and Charleston, the warehouse platforms in Manchester built to a rail gauge that hadn't been standardized yet. Under this model, the 1810s and 1820s weren't periods of creation. They were periods of rediscovery and repurposing. Engineers weren't anticipating the future. They were working with remnants of the past. This interpretation treats Tartaria as a metaphor, a lost infrastructural baseline that 19th century expansion reconnected with. It doesn't require a hidden empire, just a discontinuity, a gap in institutional memory between what was built and what was remembered. The third interpretation is systemic, coordinated deployment. This view focuses on the administrative simultaneity, the Board of Trade Regulations, the second bank's financial categories, the standardized architectural features appearing in multiple cities at once. It suggests centralized planning, not at the level of conspiracy but at the level of governance. A transatlantic coordination of infrastructure development, possibly driven by economic or geopolitical pressures we no longer fully understand. Under this model, the over-engineered ports and railways weren't accidental. They were part of a deliberate, large-scale system, built rapidly, built uniformly, built in anticipation of a reorganization that was already underway. Tartaria, in this context, becomes a label for the organizational entity behind that coordination. Not a nation but a network. Not a government but a framework. None of these interpretations can be proven from the evidence alone. But all three align with the same starting point, 1816, the year without a summer. The year after Mount Tambora erupted in Indonesia, sending ash into the stratosphere and triggering global crop failures. Historians document the famine, the cold, the agricultural collapse. What they discuss less often is the infrastructure response. Within 2 years of 1816, canal projects began across the United States and Britain. Port cities expanded. Administrative bodies were chartered. Water systems and railways entered planning phases. The timeline suggests urgency. Not the slow optimism of civic ambition, but rapid, coordinated mobilization. As though the infrastructure wasn't being built for gradual growth, but for immediate reorganization. When we use the term Tartaria, in the context of these port cities, we're not invoking a lost civilization. We're pointing at a pattern in the historical record that resists easy explanation. Infrastructure that anticipates need by decades. Administrative systems designed for technologies that don't exist yet. Foundations that fit the future with unsettling precision. Whether that represents ambitious planning, inherited remnants, or coordinated deployment, the evidence invites examination. The docks were ready before the ships arrived. The tunnels were ready before the trains existed. The foundations were ready before the buildings were raised. And in 1816, something began that turned underutilized infrastructure into exactly what the world would need. The ports didn't grow into their capacity. The capacity was already there, waiting. The question isn't whether Tartaria existed as an empire. The question is, what were the foundations built for? And why does the answer feel like it's still underground?